Hello, my wonderful viewers, and welcome to another episode of Betty Adams Overanalyzes. Once again, we jump into deep waters running just under the science fiction surface of Lost in Space. Here's my proposal for this episode. The show has written John Robinson as the classic chivalric knight and set Will Robinson and Robot Robinson as counterpoints to illustrate exactly what that means. But what does it mean, and why did they do it? I present to your imagination another image, a sheepdog named Lancelot, a sandy-furred creature with long bangs hanging over his sparkling blue eyes. His tongue lolls out to the side of his mouth. He is looking at you in that friendly yet calculating way a sheepdog looks at all strangers. Pull that image up in your head and hold on to it. We will get back to it, I promise. Today's question in general goes back to what makes Lost in Space so good. What sets it apart from the rest of the crowd of science fiction? The common forgettable mass of science fiction devolves into explosions and screen flares in an attempt to keep your attention. How does Lost in Space get away with an episode that consists of a middle-aged man and woman talking out their marital problems? They're trapped under a satellite dish. I mean, think of how cheap that scene was. 2 actors and a bottle for their only prop. This is something you would do in acting school to practice technique. And yet this scene is seared into the minds of the fans as they dissect it for meaning. There was something more in the darkness there with John and Maureen. The answer is that the writers of this show are pulling a very old science fiction trope out of their hats. You see, they are not telling a science fiction story. They are not telling a genre story. They are telling a very old and very human story and wrapping it in the tight-fitting spacesuit of a science fiction story. And they are cruising a well-established space lane here, especially with this particular story. H.G. Wells told the story in his classic The Time Machine with the cannibalistic Morlocks and the adorable but ineffectual Eloi. Star Trek has this story as a chronic backdrop with their pacifistic Vulcans and Betazoids contrasted against first the Klingons, then the Cardassians, and finally the Borg. And now Lost in Space joins their ranks in telling the story of the necessity of the chivalric knight to civilization. Now, to quote one of the fathers of modern science fiction, C.S. Lewis, chivalry has meant many things at many times, from heavy cavalry to giving a woman a seat on the bus. But for what separates chivalry out as an idea separate from other ideals, Lewis directs us to the medieval work by Sir Thomas Malory, The Death of King Arthur. The fictional example of near-perfect chivalry, Sir Lancelot, being dead is being eulogized by the rector. That's an old-fashioned pastor for any of those of you who haven't read everything by Jane Austen. So the rector says, "Thou wert the meekest man who ever ate in hall among ladies, and thou wert the sternest knight to thy mortal foe that ever put spear in the rest." Lancelot, the greatest of the fictional knights, was an ideal the author was trying to capture, and this ideal brought 2 things together that do not naturally attract: brute physical courage and childlike meekness. Lancelot is not a moderation of meekness and violence. He is both violent to the nth and meek to the nth, as C.S. Lewis handily points out. The old bromide of a bully always being a coward and a strong man always being gentle is provably false by a single glance at our history books or 5 minutes on the school playground. I would add that any basic understanding of heritable personality traits would also lead to this conclusion, but our medium is here storytelling, not reality. Fiction, not history or genetics. Glancing back past the birth of the chivalric hero in the Middle Ages, we find such gems as Odysseus, Hercules, and Beowulf, men or demi-men of courage to be sure, but brutal in a way that would never be accepted as heroic by a modern audience. These heroes of old slew their enemies as they begged for mercy, took them captive to kill at their leisure, treated their fallen foes like animals. Does this sound wrong? That is because every modern retelling that wanted to make a buck or two has toned down their brutality to enemy and ally alike to make them more palatable to a culture who grew up in the ruins of the chivalric traditions, as Lewis put it. And a special example is the genteel makeover Odin and Thor have gotten, with even otherwise accurate historians refusing to mention how utterly brutal the old stories actually are. No, the warrior who is meek in hall and effective in combat is indeed a creation of the medieval age, and yet has become so central to our idea of a hero that the heroes of older ages are retconned to match this ideal. and a creation it had to be. While our individual choices are not a genetic predisposition, the aspect of courage most certainly is. Mice can be easily bred to be courageous or timid. The Russians only very recently bred an utterly fearless fox and another bloodline of fox so timid that it would hide until it starved to death in the wild. And here we have Lancelot the sheepdog. Remember that animal I asked you to remember? The sheepdog serves the natural world the same way the knight serves cultural. It is not a devouring wolf that will descend on a flock and devour without mercy to satisfy its hunger. A wolf is something perfectly natural, untrained. So is the sheep. The sheep is meekness personified. It minds its own business, harms no one, and is utterly incapable of defending itself. It too is something utterly natural. Neither of these things are good or evil, they simply are, but they do not serve the needs of humanity very well. So humanity created the sheepdog. Now, a sheepdog, like the knight, is no balance between the meekness of the sheep and the ferocity of the wolf. It is even fiercer than the wolf, and even meeker than the sheep. A sheepdog will take abuse that no sheep would stand, and take it with utter meekness. A sheepdog will pursue an enemy with ferocity long after even the fiercest wolf would have given up the fight as impractical. A sheep must be caught and tossed by force to expose its belly for shearing. A sheepdog will come of its own volition and present its belly to be rubbed by its master. A wolf will never expend more energy on a hunt than it will get in calories in return. A sheepdog will pursue a threat to its flock long past any calories the threat might contain. Meek to the nth, fierce to the nth, and a deliberately creation of human will, not a product of nature. This is the sheepdog Lancelot, this is the chivalric knight. And this is what the show made John Robinson. Now, as I mentioned before, it is in this day and age perfectly normal to make your hero chivalric. Superman is the ultimate example of this, as are all the best iterations of Batman. Picard is this, as is Cisco, a Blit in very different ways. You can see either one going head-to-head with a Klingon, or handing a child a flower. It's perfectly normal for a show to use this trope. But you see, Lost in Space has made a point of it. They've made this concept their core. The show has gone far beyond simply making a point of it. This concept of the sheepdog, or the chivalric knight, has been at the core of both seasons, driving the characters, exploring why this concept is so important, why it was created in the first place, and what happens when those who are supposed to be the knights fail in this delicate, artificial, essential balance of meekness and ferocity. In the first season, the Robinsons are trapped in a wilderness. They are isolated from civilization. So in this case, let's compare John to the sheepdog. Here we have John Robinson, trained Marine, loving father. Then you have the sheep as represented by Will Robinson. He can't even be truly described as meek, he's just weak. And the wolf is symbolized or created in the character of Robot. John Robinson is meek to the nth in this season, mostly as illustrated by how Marine treats him. He accepts her subtle and biting digs with quiet fortitude, almost never defending himself. He allows her to determine the course of their actions. He is content to let her lead. He is also at the same time fierce to the nth. He charges without hesitation into the very literal jaws of the attacking eels. He instantly leaps to defend his family from Robot when Robot first appears. Will. Now, Will starts the series as a complete sheep, and the show does not hesitate to show how dangerous that can be. When there is danger, Will freezes, helpless to even serve his own needs, let alone the needs of others. His inability to swim down to the Jupiter due to fear nearly dooms them all. His panicked flailing traps him on the other side of the ice wall from his family, rendering him useless. He is one of those who cannot defend the things that make life worth living. But there he meets Robot on the other side of that ice. Now, Robot at this point is a wolf. He descended on the herd of the Resolute and wreaked a merry havoc. In the scenes we see the Robot on the Resolute, he isn't just going after a goal. He is stopping, turning, taking the time to massacre as many humans as possible. He is the barbarian wreaking havoc. Now, we still don't know his exact motivations for helping Will and the rest of the Robinsons in that moment when he arrives on the ice. But from this, character arc is very obvious. Robot is the wolf being made into a sheepdog, or the barbarian being trained into knighthood. He learns first to care for Will, then the family, then the colonists at large, then life in general, then even to care for his enemies, all the while maintaining his ferocity. And the cost, the danger of him not completing this arc is clear. Will's arc mirrors Robot. He must learn first to defend and care for himself, then to defend and care for his friend, then his family, then the Resolute and its crew, then even his enemies. Will has not true meekness, but weakness in spades, developing that weakness into true knightly meekness through strengthening his inherent ferocity. And both Will and Robot experience these arcs through the leadership of the senior knight, John Robinson. These themes are developed further in the second season, with Robot Robinson's newfound meekness blossoming as he shows care for the horse gypsy and for Scarecrow. Robot has to be fierce to the point of defying his family. He is meek to the point of letting himself be captured and tortured, knowing full well what was going to happen. Will develops his ferocity enough to stand up to the charging horde of robots, and yet still shows mercy to them when they're trapped and helpless. And John Robinson's knightly qualities are illustrated in a very clear fashion. In the scene where Judy is giving her school presentation, he is literally standing and hiding in the corner, giving his lady the seat. He blushes and nearly starts to cry as Judy hails him as her hero. He shows compassion and kindness to the very woman who brought a weapon into his house and nearly got him killed. He also charges into a room full of a half a dozen armed and armored men and defeats them in honest combat. But the show doesn't stop with showing us a fully fledged knight and his two apprentices. The show also offers several illustrations of what happened when this creative process goes wrong. Look to our two fallen knights, Adler and Hastings. Both men were clearly raised to be knights, protectors to serve their people, but the process went wrong somewhere, either due to their own internal weaknesses or due to some flaw in their training. Hastings is no knight, but a bully whose fierceness is tempered only by an outward show of meekness. He is utterly confident that he is always right, that his choices are what is best. He has become worse than the wolf and the barbarian because he can lie or present himself as a knight, but lacks true meekness. And yet, he is neither wolf nor barbarian because he does make decisions to protect the herd on some level, his colony. And when he is wrong, because he has this training, because he can fake meekness and still maintain himself as a part of the colony, the consequences of his wrong choices are terrible. Adler, on the other hand, is weakness personified with only the outward trappings of ferocity. He can fake it when he's surrounded by other men to do his bidding, or when he's very well armed. He can wield a weapon in the same way that Hastings wields meek words. But Adler is at heart a coward, a milksop who bends to Hastings. Adler was ordered to treat Scarecrow like an object. Adler knew it is wrong to treat a person like an object. Therefore, Adler, one of the weak and unable to defend his own convictions or his friend, lied to himself, telling himself and anyone else who would listen that Scarecrow was a machine, a thing, not a person. This allowed him to treat Scarecrow like a thing without his conscience choking him. In their redemption scenes, Hastings must bow and show meekness, and Adler has to stand displaying ferocity. But neither are true knights. Hastings is still a wolf, or less than a wolf, and Adler still less than a sheep. As the show heads into its third season, we're left with the knight John Robinson guarding the main colony, and the junior knights of Will and Robot guarding the children. It will be interesting to see where the show takes this dynamic, because I don't think this was all accidental. Sure, some ancient concepts will seep into modern media, simply for the reason that these ancient concepts form the basis of our culture, even if the creators didn't intend it. They are these concepts, these old stories of the chivalric knight, of the sheepdog. These are elements that are essential to the Western mindset, and sometimes they simply show up because it's almost impossible for an author to write without them. But I don't think that was the case here. I don't think it was coincidence that the most obvious marker of Robot and Will completing their arcs of knighthood was them bonding over a horse. Even a chessboard uses the horse as a symbol of knighthood instead of an actual armored human. That might be more logical. So, if the show is doing this deliberately, where will it go from here? What do you think, my wonderful viewers? Am I seeing patterns in the clouds, or did the Lost in Space writers slip us a classic chivalric tale under the guise of a shiny robot story? Leave a like below if you agree, or leave a comment atomizing my arguments if you disagree. Peace out, my wonderful viewers.